Good morning, everyone. There we go. Have you ever felt intimidated or unqualified when undertaking a task? I think we all have. It could be a fix-it-up job at home. It could be at work, perhaps even a role in the church. Today I want to talk about a young man that dealt with these emotions and feelings in the Bible. He wrote one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark seems to me like the least read Gospel. No one starts there. And once you get through Matthew, you sort of go over to John and then Luke. And I think there's reason for it. It doesn't have the same discourses and theology of the other three. But it has its own... what's the word I'm looking for? It has its own thing. It is the shortest gospel. It's very direct, and it's the fastest gospel. It was written in Rome for the Romans at the time. The author doesn't appear in the book, and in fact it doesn't appear in the other gospels either. The first place it appears is when Luke mentions him in Acts. And if you have your Bibles, we'll turn to Acts chapter 12, where we'll find him. Now, just some background, a bit of context around this time. This was not long after the conversion of Saul. At the time, there was a prophet in Antioch whose name was Agabus, and he foresaw a great world famine coming. And so the church in Antioch sent relief to the believers in Jerusalem through Barnabas and Saul. And this is where we pick up the story. Acts chapter 12, and I'll read 1 to 4. Now about that time, Herod, the king, stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. Now this is Herod Agrippa, and as he wanted favour with the Jews, killed James, the brother of John, and then when he saw how much pleased the Jews, he went and captured Peter also, but wanted to wait till after Passover to do with his head as well. Now, I'm just going to skip through the story. Peter goes to prison, and then he's rescued by an angel. So if we just go a few verses down to verse 11 and 12, we'll pick it up again. And when Peter had come to himself, and he said, "Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel, and he has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish people." So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. This is our first reference of Mark in the New Testament. And he's only mentioned here because of his mother. It's pretty much a side note. Now, the house of Mary, the reason that the house was identified with a woman probably means that she was a widow. And she had the name of what seemed to be every second female in the New Testament, Mary. So the only way to... the only way to discern her from other Marys, Luke mentions her son, John, also known as Mark. Now, the church met at this house. Peter knew where to go. He wasn't led. They met there often. And so it's safe to assume that Peter knew Mark, and Mark knew Peter, and would have listened to Peter preach and teach, and he was a young man at this time, could have been a teenager. All right, let's go down a few verses to where he's mentioned again. And now this is still in Acts 12, but in verse 25. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and they also took with them John, whose surname was Mark. John was his Jewish name, and Mark was his Gentile name. But here they take John named Mark with him. It's his first indication of his usefulness, but it's still nondescript. They don't say what he is or what he does. It just says he takes them. They take him. The next verse, in Acts 13, verse 1, it says, Now in the church that was in Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers, and it goes through a list of names. It goes through Barnabas, Simeon, Lucius, Manaen, and Saul. It doesn't mention Mark. Mark wasn't a teacher, wasn't a prophet. He doesn't say if he's a fisherman or a carpenter. No qualification here at all. So why take him? Well, it turns out in Colossians, and we'll get there later, but he was Barnabas' cousin. So Barnabas knew him, and he knew his qualities and his strengths and weaknesses, and trusted him to a degree. Reading on, 2 to 5. As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Spirit said, Now separate to me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. Then having fasted and prayed, they laid hands on them and sent them away. So being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they went down to Seleucia, and from there they sailed to Cyprus. And when they arrived in Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews. They also had John as their assistant. So this is their first missionary trip. Take John Mark, and it's the first description of Mark, but it's as an assistant, as a helper, and that's it. So they're in Cyprus, and they're doing their missionary work, but it's difficult. I'm paraphrasing the next few verses. They find oppression, they find it's not that easy. It's a dangerous road as well. So when they get almost through Cyprus, we'll go to verse 13 of chapter 13. Now when Paul and his party set sail from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. John leaves, goes home. It doesn't say why in the verse, and later we have some indication why. But there's a passage in Acts of the Apostles where Ellen White sort of elaborates on the situation going on here. Just a small paragraph. And she says, It was here that Mark, overwhelmed with fear and discouragement, wavered for a time in his purpose to give himself wholeheartedly to the Lord's work. Unused to hardships, he was disheartened by the perils and privations of the way. He had laboured with success under favourable circumstances, but now amidst the opposition and perils that so often beset the pioneer worker, he failed to endure hardness as a good soldier of the cross. He had yet to learn to face danger and persecution and adversity with a brave heart. As the apostles advanced and still greater difficulties were apprehended, Mark was intimidated and, losing all courage, refused to go further and returned to Jerusalem. So he goes home. A young man, it's not necessarily what he expected, and he could serve, but under certain pressures and where his life was in danger, he called it no more. Now, we don't hear about Mark for a few years after this. It's only till later he comes back up again, and it's within a conversation between Paul and Barnabas. Just a few chapters later, in chapter 15:36 to 41. Now this is some time later. Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing." Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another, and so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. The contention became so sharp that disagreement became so heated that they couldn't work together anymore. Paul and Barnabas couldn't work together. They disagreed. And so Barnabas takes John Mark, Paul takes Silas. Again, Ellen White commentates and says, "The desertion caused Paul, of Mark, to judge Mark unfavourably, and even severely for a time. Barnabas, on the other hand, was inclined to excuse him because of his inexperience. He was a young guy. He felt anxious that Mark should not abandon the ministry, for he saw in him qualifications that would fit him to be a useful worker for Christ." So Barnabas obviously saw, although Mark was young, there were talents there. That complete discouragement, that it wouldn't be beneficial even to his own spiritual life, to keep him busy, to keep him involved. Now, it's not until 10 years later. We don't hear from Barnabas for another 2 years. We don't hear from Mark for another 10 years. We don't hear from him again. And it's not until it's in a letter from Paul, while he's a prisoner, do we hear Mark being mentioned. And so we'll go check it out. It's in Colossians chapter 4. And verse 10. Paul is now imprisoned. He's in Rome. And he's writing to one of the churches. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. 10 years later, the unqualified deserter is with Paul in Rome. He's one of his companions. Now, what on earth happened? I would have loved to be a fly on the wall to when these two somehow mended their relationship. And it's so much so that Paul even trusts him, where he says, if he comes to you, welcome him. Paul's going to send him to this church. He's going to send Mark on a mission. That's how much he trusts him now. It's amazing. Now, shortly after this, Mark is mentioned again, but not by Paul. He's mentioned again, but this time by Peter. 1 Peter chapter 5. We'll see what he has to say. First Peter chapter 5 verse 13. She who is in Babylon, speaking of Rome the city, elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son. The reason Peter uses the word Babylon is because the persecution at this time was so great that they had to speak in code. He's in Rome, well, she who is in Rome, and he calls Mark his son. Now, he wasn't his literal son, but he was his spiritual son. And now to think that Mark is in Rome with another apostle where the persecution at the time was the worst, after he'd run away for the same reason for much less 10 years prior. Now, if we backtrack, I think it's safe to assume that Peter was Mark's spiritual father or mentor back in his mother's house, when Peter would visit and preach. And it's significant because early church history writers mentions that Mark took a lot of the book of Mark came from the stories from Peter. The book of Mark was influenced by Peter's first-hand accounts. Peter and Mark spent a lot of time together as a young man listening to him, and when he was older and he was in the mission field. A couple years after this, Mark is mentioned again, and this time by Paul during his second imprisonment. We are now in 2 Timothy chapter 4, and this is shortly before Paul's death. It's his last letter to Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 4, 9 to 11. Be diligent to come to me quickly. Paul's urgent here. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved the present world, and has departed for Thessalonica. Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. What a turnaround. This is Paul's last letter shortly before his death. All his friends have deserted him. Only Luke is with him. And he calls for Timothy with urgency, but he makes a point, bring Mark, because he is useful to me. The same guy who he fought tooth and nail not to take with him years prior and to separate from his partner at the time. It is the story of the restored deserter. We have all at some point deserted what we knew to be right, what we knew should have been done, to some point, to some degree, some level. We're all recovering sinners. If God can use an unqualified deserter to write one of the Gospels and become one of the friends and companions of not only Paul but Peter, then God can use you, young or old, for anything. To take a Sabbath school lesson, to take part in evangelism, to build a church. We're all unqualified. We all feel unqualified. We all feel inadequate. But we all have the ability to be a restored deserter. And that is our gift. Amen.
Good morning. I feel a bit funny standing up here. I kind of just want to pace. Life can be pretty hard to navigate at times. I'm sure that you've all experienced different things, and you can probably agree with that statement. And I'm not going to speak about one Bible character today, but I'm here to talk about 3 traps. All right. You will have all heard how to trap a monkey. It's a very old fable. I'm sure I've heard my dad use this story in many a kids' gig down the front here. So I'm talking about 3 traps, and each has an analogy, and they're all trapping animals. So I'm a, whole food, plant-based, animal advocate, tree-hugging person, so it's not about killing animals. Hopefully you can get the deeper meaning. How to trap a monkey. So if you chain a jar full of peanuts and you put it somewhere where the monkeys all like to gather, the fable goes that the monkeys come, and monkeys, they're clever, but they get this funny thing going on where when they see the peanuts, they get their hand in the jar, and we all know the story, and their hand's in there, and they actually use a jar that has a smaller opening up the top so they can fit their hand in, but if they have any peanuts, they can't pull their hand out. And so the monkey will be there trying to get the peanuts out, and he can see the trapper coming, and the trapper's coming, and he's getting more and more frantic, and he's pulling, and he's pulling, and he's really stressing out. But the monkey does not let go of the peanuts. He can let go of those peanuts at any time he wants, but he doesn't let go of the peanuts, and he gets caught. So for me, what a funny, stupid little story, but there is a deeper meaning. We all can probably relate to this analogy because we all have areas in our life where we have things that we can't let go of. And I was having a think about some characters in the Bible, and there's so many characters that fit into this. I guess they have had experiences where they struggle to let go. The first one I thought of was Saul. Saul, in the Bible, if we look in 1 Samuel 15, it actually talks about how handsome he was and how he stood a head taller than everybody else, and he was picked by Samuel, and he looked like a king. So Saul, though, when we think of his life, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I'm jumping around looking at many different characters, but Saul did struggle with not being able to surrender his own ideas and desires. He couldn't let stuff go. He thought he knew better. We think of a couple of examples where he ignores instructions or he justifies himself. I'm sure you can remember the time, and it's fairly early in his reign, I think it was his 2nd year, where he jumped the gun with making a sacrifice. And we look at the whole surrounding scenario, and it seems pretty complicated. He'd just, been fighting the enemy, and there was all these soldiers were waiting around, and he was waiting and waiting for Samuel, who had to come and perform this sacrifice, and he waited 7 days, and he's getting really antsy, and he's like, come on, why can't I just do the sacrifice? The instructions were clear. He wasn't meant to do the sacrifice, but he did it anyway. He thought he knew better. Samuel came and was pretty cranky. Said he'd done the wrong thing. He disobeyed God. We have another example of Saul doing the same thing, jumping the gun, thinking he knew better. And this is when, after fighting the Amalekites, which were one of the most wicked nations around, and obviously we get this impression because they had to destroy everything, animals, all the spoils, all the people. I really struggle with this sort of thing, and we all have our own struggles, but we have to trust, obviously, that God knew best, and there was a good reason for it. King Saul didn't do that, did he? He thought he knew better. So Samuel came and, again, this is when he actually tore his garment and said, that's it, you're done. You're not going to be king anymore because you didn't follow God's instructions. You thought you knew better. You couldn't let go of your own will. So he didn't kill the king, King Agag, and he spared a lot of the spoils he thought he could make do with. And then Saul's life just continues down this same pattern where he just can't surrender. He holds on to his own will, but he's actually deeply insecure. And later on, when he's hunting for David, it's this constant, hiding in the caves. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I've done wrong. Oh, but he gets angry again, and he just can't let go. Then at the end of his life, we see him consulting a witch, which, again, is another area where it's very clear that he's insecure within himself, but still doesn't surrender to God's will. The next person that I thought of, and, we could go through the scripture and pull out so many different characters because, just like us, there are many examples. Jonah was another guy, and we all know the story of Jonah. Very obviously struggled to surrender his own ideas and willpower, didn't he? He didn't want to go to Nineveh, went to Tarshish instead, thought he knew better. And I'm not going to go into that too much. Really, it was just God's grace that gave him the second chance, because he should have, should have died, should have missed out. Another one that we thought of is Ananias and Sapphira. We don't have a lot of detail with this story, but we do know that, again, they'd made a commitment, they had great intentions, but they didn't let go. They couldn't let go of thinking that they knew better. And they had a pretty awful sort of ending because of that. I've got 3 traps, so I'll keep talking. I hope I'm not talking too fast. As I was thinking through my own life, we're all guilty of this whole not being able to let go of our own ideas, even when we know that we might not be doing the right thing. I keep banging on about this to my kids. Do what you know is right, over and over, and hoping one day it's going to get through. One really quick story that reminded me of this whole idea was when I was actually, I think I was about grade 3 or 4 at a little public school with Josh. And we were waiting out the front for Mum, and everyone kind of had already been picked up, and we were chilling out there, and a scary man in a yellow car came and parked opposite where we were waiting out the front of school. And I was sitting here with Josh, and the man had a really scary face. We kind of just pretended we didn't see him. And then he poked his head out the window and was beckoning us to come. And I remember looking at Josh, and Josh was like grade 2 or whatever. He was pretty little, and he was scared, and I was scared. And we're like, what are we going to do? And I remember him opening the door and coming out across the road to get us. And Josh, being the goody two-shoes that he was like, let's tell the teachers. But I was like I knew that was the right thing to do, but I was a bit embarrassed, and I thought I knew better. I'm like, no, let's run for the tunnel. So we jumped over the fence, and we scrambled for the playground, for the tunnel. And we were lucky, we were praying, probably both of us, I know I was, that Mum, just as we were getting into the tunnel, which was the wrong thing to do because he'd crossed the road and was trying to get over the fence after us, Mum came in, and we're like, oh, phew. He went back in his car and zoomed off, and we chased him. And we found he had just got out of jail. He had a criminal record. So we were really lucky that day. But I think, I was only a kid, but I didn't do what I knew was right, I should have gone to the teacher. I don't know what I was thinking. I obviously just thought I could hide from the bad guy and everything was going to be all right. Anyway, next trap. There's my arrow. Trap 2. How to trap a frog. This term actually, this phenomenon is called poikilothermia. Does anyone know that? What poikilothermia is? You know that? It's about the frog in the hot water. So this is actually legit. They've tested it many times. If you put a cute little froggy in a pot of cold water, he's swimming around and he's happy as Larry. There's no lid on the pot. The pot is not too tall. The frog can jump out at any time. If you heat up that pot at such a slow little increment that he doesn't even notice the water's getting warmer and warmer and warmer, that frog will boil to death. That frog can get out at any stage, just out he goes, he's safe. Does he do it? Silly frog. So, this is, for me, all about desensitization. And, we are very aware of that whole desensitization thing that happens. But we all get complacent, don't we? We're all guilty of being affected by desensitization. One young guy, and I am very aware that obviously this is meant to be about youth, so we all have looked at characters that are younger. Hezekiah. Who knows the story very well about Hezekiah? It's a really cool story. Hezekiah was 25 when he became king of Judah. Was it Judah or Israel? Judah. Here we are. So 2 Kings 18. It actually says in chapter 18 here, he trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. Blah, 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 blah. It goes on about how he prospered, blah, blah, blah. And there's quite a lot of detail in the story about Hezekiah. You might be familiar with how Sennacherib, so he obviously didn't want to be subject to, was it the Philistines? It was Assyria, sorry. Sennacherib didn't like it, and so he came against them. And they had a massive army. And so we have Hezekiah within the walls and freaking out about Sennacherib and all the army around who were coming to get him. And you know the story where God performed an amazing miracle and the angel of death came and wiped them all out. They didn't have to do anything. And Hezekiah had, a really amazing reign over Judah, where he got rid of all the idolatry from the kings beforehand. He brought the nation back to God, and lots of good stuff was happening. Then we know the story how he got crook. So he got really sick. He was on his deathbed, and he didn't want to die. He was not ready to die. And he had a whinge to God about it, and he didn't want to die. And what happened? You know the story about the sundial. So God was amazing to Hezekiah, wasn't he? How cool would that be to actually have such a sign and to ask for a sign and to have God honor it? So they were obviously pretty tight. God loved Hezekiah. But getting to the bit where he got complacent, Hezekiah obviously was blessed by God and was close to God, and God looked after him. He made him well. He killed his enemies, and he gave him a very successful reign. But Hezekiah, after he was healed, did a silly thing. And we read about this when the Babylonian dudes came along. Babylonian envoys, they're called. These guys came up, and I don't know, they weren't enemies at the time, but Hezekiah decided that he was feeling pretty comfortable and he was pretty proud, and he showed the Babylonians everything, didn't he? All the good stuff, all his riches, all his secrets, everything. He was really proud of where they were at, but he didn't really think. He was complacent. And what happened later on? That's right, the Babylonians came back after he died. And the Bible actually lines out here where Isaiah comes and tells him. He says, "Then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and said to him, 'What did these men say, and from where did they come to you?' So Hezekiah said, 'They came from a far country, from Babylon.' And he said, 'What have they seen in your house?' Hezekiah answered, 'They've seen all that is in my house. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not shown them.' Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, 'Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that's in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day will be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left.' Blah, 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 blah." So, silly thing. But I can relate to Hezekiah in some ways, because how easy is it when everything's good and God is looking after us and we feel like, we're chugging along in life, to get a bit complacent? It's pretty easy, isn't it? To forget, like when you're struggling and you're having a hard time and you're crying out to God to help me with this, save me from that, whatever, that's when you're like, I don't know, you feel a bit closer to God. But when everything's cruisy, it's really easy to be like the frog and, you get pretty desensitized. One quick story. Another example from the Bible. Disciples. Right when Jesus needed them. They'd been living with Jesus for how long? They were the closest friends. And right at that time, that night, when Jesus said to them, "Watch and pray." In Luke 22. "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation." He's sweating blood. He's having angels come to him to give him that strength because he knows what's about to happen. Where were his mates? Asleep. You'd think they'd know better. But no, they were complacent. They weren't tapped in, were they? They got like, a bit meh. Another quick story, just because I like kind of hearing lots of stories. When I was at college, I was lucky enough to have the experience to do a practical, so I'm a teacher doing teaching, a practical experience at the Carryong Detention Centre, which is the all-boys jail in Carryong, which is near Gosford. And it's pretty big, and it was really quite an eye-opening experience. So when we rocked up there was two of us, and then one of them ended up dropping out, so it was just little me. There were all these boys, and they were about year 9, year 10, and my prac was teaching art. They were all wearing like these weird tracksuits with different coloured t-shirts depending on which cell they were from. Instead of morning worship, we had like I can't remember what they called it now, debriefing, like sharing, and you'd hear about what happened in the jail the night before and who wasn't allowed to come to school and who was and who smoked whose Band-Aids and who did what to who, and it was really hectic. I was teaching art, and I only had a little class of like 4 or 5, and they were mostly they're all different kind of ethnicities, but mostly kind of guys around year 10 level. So at the start it was hectic. Like we had a guard on call. I had like I was like, what, speakers and everything. And if any kid, like I had one situation where at the end of every class you had to collect their pens because the night before someone had stabbed someone in the neck with a pen because they smuggled it from class. So at the end of class, I was like, okay, Mark, pens, I'll give me your pen. And he looked at me and he was like, not going to give me his pen. And all I had to do was like hit the alarm. And the guards come in. It was that, like, it was pretty cool. But I got desensitized. Well, yeah, as a teacher in that sort of situation, it's like instant response, instant consequences, and yeah, it was kind of exciting. But I got to know the boys after a while quite well, and I forgot that they were murderers and rapists and criminals and whatever. I didn't actually know what they'd done, but I know there were some hectically bad people there. But when you get to know people and you start to build a relationship with them, I don't know, I'm probably too innocent and silly, but I lost that sense of, danger, and I got a bit complacent. And there was just one scenario that, I don't know if it didn't cut my experience short, but I definitely got in trouble for it. And we had to go on duty, and we had different areas, and I'd been there for I would have been about 3 or 4 weeks by that stage, so I was like feeling pretty equipped. And in my area, I only had 2 boys who were just shooting hoops, and I knew the boys. I'd been teaching art for a while with them, and all the other guys were all having a wow of a time in the pool, which was like quite a while away. And I was just standing there, and after a while, I'm like, I'm just going to go shoot some hoops with the boys. So we were shooting basketball, we were chatting and bouncing and chatting. It was fun. And another guy came at the pool and came over, and he's like, oh, let's play a game, let's play 2-on-2. And I was like, oh, all right, kick off my shoes. So we're playing 2-on-2. And then after a while, a few other boys joined, oh, we want to play 2. And then I kind of was so busy playing, and I noticed that there were more people around, and then we had teams, and then there were people all watching. And I saw that there was another teacher there watching, and I kind of didn't think about it too much. But after a while, there was a lot of energy. The boys were yelling and pushing and shoving and yelling out stuff that was probably a little bit disrespectful to me, and there was a lot of people getting a bit violent and antsy, and anything like this amongst these sort of boys can be a little bit hectic. So yeah, they ended up calling in other teachers and separating a few of the boys who were hustling and fighting, and other ones who were yelling at rude things. And I was in trouble because silly me in my little shorts and t-shirt, the only female teacher there was playing basketball, wasn't thinking very well at all, because I'd got to know the boys and I'd developed too much trust. So I'd got complacent and could have, ended up in something that was fairly dangerous. Silly me. Trap 3. I don't know if you've heard this analogy or this fable, but Eskimos catch wolves. Are there wolves with Eskimos? The story is talk about Eskimos catching wolves, so we'll go with that. How to catch a wolf, how to trap a wolf. You put a piece of meat out in an area where you know the wolves will come, but you hide a really sharp dagger in the meat. So when the wolf comes, he starts licking the meat and he's excited. You obviously have to attach it or whatever, and he's tearing at it, and there's blood oozing, and it's pretty delicious. But after a while, there's that knife hidden in there, and he's into the meat so much he doesn't realize it's actually cutting his tongue. And so as the knife's hacking up his tongue, he's actually drinking his own blood. And so it's pretty gross. So he's so fixated there, eating the meat, he's actually bleeding out. And then obviously the hunter can come and do his thing. Gross story, hey? But yes, again, another trap. With this trap, first of all, I thought it was about pleasure. And we all, are pleasure seekers. And I think that God made us to enjoy pleasure and enjoy living a life here on earth. But we all can be wary of becoming so involved in whatever we're doing that we lose our awareness. We lose sight of the big picture. I quickly just thought of Samson, because that's the most obvious example when we're talking about Bible characters, and he was quite young as well. We always hear about Samson, all the wrong things he did and all the gruesome things he did, but he actually judged Israel for 20 years. So he did do the Lord's work for quite some time there. Again, in Samson 14, one of the first things we hear about him is how he wanted to go and marry from the enemy camp, didn't he? He got the hots for the wrong girl. And we are left with this impression that that was a wrong thing. But the very next verse, it actually says this was God's plan. I don't know if you've read that next verse, because that was the way that he was meant to kind of then start his whole work with fighting the enemy. But this idea that Samson was a pleasure seeker or couldn't control his desires, especially for the wrong type of women, very much was carried through the whole book, wasn't it? Because he ended up with Delilah, who was a harlot. And I think in this instance, like, he'd done a lot of things that were very much attacking the enemy, which was sort of the purpose and part of what he was meant to be doing, I realise. But when he was with Delilah, he did lose sight of what he was meant to be doing, didn't he? And he lost that awareness because he ended up spilling everything to Delilah, and that brought him to his demise. And yeah, it's a really sad story. I don't really like the story of Samson, but I think it's a good example of this losing your awareness because you become so involved and preoccupied with whatever you're doing. Solomon is another example, I think, of this same thing. When you get so busy, you leave God out, or you get so stuck in what you're doing. Solomon definitely lost sight of God for a while there, didn't he? Despite his wisdom. So we have in 1 Kings, it talks about how he fell in love with he had many wives. 1 Kings, I had a little marker here. I'll read you. 11. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, and from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." And Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. So that spells it out pretty clearly, doesn't it? He got lost. He left God out. And I'm not going to go into stories in my life where I do this, but I think out of all the traps, this is the one, not that I'm a massive pleasure seeker at all, but I find that I have a tendency to leave God out, which is easy to do. I get so busy and so stuck in all the things I think I'm doing, and most of those things I think are coming from good intentions and I'm serving others. But how easy is it to get so just preoccupied and busy that you leave God out? Well, we all do it, I'm sure. So, real quick summary, because I know that we're going over time. Don't get trapped. Number one, details matter. So, think about the monkey not wanting to let go, wanting to do his own thing despite knowing it's a stupid thing to do. He still wanted it. He wanted those peanuts. He could see the hunter. He didn't let go. Stupid behavior, but we all do it. Contrast like people like Jonah and that get stuck on their own thing to Daniel. I mean, Daniel, every detail was paramount. He didn't even shut his door like when he wanted to pray to save his soul. Save himself, sorry. His soul was definitely saved. He, he could have eaten a bit of the food offered to idols, couldn't he? I mean, seriously? No, every detail, he stuck to the letter of the law, and God honoured it. So you can definitely contrast, Daniel to some other examples like Saul that we have, who thought that he knew better. We need to do what we know is right. Number two, think about the next trap, which was what? The frog, poikilothermia, frog in the hot water. So we need to stay sensitive. So in the good times, don't forget what God's done for us. Don't wait until it gets really hard to be like, oh, God. We need to be, even in the good times, remembering and not letting ourselves fall into that complacency trap. And number three, what was the trap? The wolf, cutting up his own tongue, sucking and drinking his own blood till he dies. Awful story. But yes, stay connected. Don't be so involved in our own lives that we lose awareness and then we just leave God out of the picture. Because we could be doing good things, couldn't we? But it's not good things that really matter. It's being connected to God. So don't get trapped.
Good afternoon. I have one more story to tell you. I want to explore what we know about a young man who's mentioned in the New Testament and reflect on what it means to honour God. His story begins with this story. I'm going to read it out for you. You'll probably remember it. At Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. The man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze on him and had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright and on your feet." And he leapt up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." Did I go one too far? There we go. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. But while the disciples stood around him, he got up and entered the city. The next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. After they had preached the gospel in that city, and he had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and on to Antioch. So that's in Acts. Imagine being a spectator to that situation. Sounds pretty violent, bit of mob violence for everyone. What would you think of Paul if you were just another guy in the town? And do you think your family background would make a difference to your opinion? The character that I want to talk about is not in that passage, but he was probably present, or he heard about the events, given he lived in that town, it would seem. Does anyone know who I'm talking about? Timothy. So just a couple of chapters later in Acts, it tells us that Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek, and he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. So it would seem likely that Timothy had either witnessed or heard about what happened with Paul and Barnabas on their prior journey through Lystra. I'm not sure if it was a couple of years earlier. I'm not sure how long ago before it was, but this is their second visit to Lystra when Timothy joins the crew. So you wonder who was Timothy, and we have a few details about him, so we're just going to reflect on those just a touch. Lois and Eunice were two notable women in his life, his grandmother and his mother. And they're mentioned because Paul knew them, and they were renowned for being sincere in their faith. It seems that he was taught the scriptures from a young age. Paul does mention that, and it's that mention that comes just before the passage that we're familiar with, where Paul says, "All scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work." Timothy was gifted in some way when he met Paul and Paul laid hands on him, and Paul refers to that in a couple of his letters. He was also circumcised by Paul, and he then travelled with Paul quite a bit. He was tasked with being an evangelist, and he was actually involved in writing the second letter to the Corinthians. He's introduced there as one of the authors. You can speculate a bit about how things were for him before he met Paul. It's interesting that he's, with his family situation, with his dad being a Greek and his mum being a Jew, I think people have talked about it. His dad probably wasn't a proselyte, given Timothy wasn't circumcised at the time when Paul came through. So I get the kind of feel that he may have been a bit on the periphery of the religion that he was brought up to believe. So this is just a little list of some of the things or some of the places that Timothy went. Apologies for the difficulty of reading that. Didn't think it would be quite that obvious. So I'll just run through some of the places he went. So he went with Paul on his journey through Phrygia, Galatia, Mysia, also to Troas, to Philippi, to Berea. He followed Paul to Athens. He was sent by Paul with Silas on a mission to Thessalonica, and also went with him to Corinth. He was noted to be with the Apostle Paul in Ephesus, and he was also sent on another mission by Paul to Macedonia, and he was afterwards accompanied by Paul in Asia. He was with the Paul when he was in Rome. He joined him there, and it seems he may have suffered imprisonment with him there at some stage as well. So I get the impression that from the time that Paul met Timothy, Timothy was a man of conviction and action. He lived and travelled supporting Paul in his mission to spread the gospel. And he stood by Paul when others didn't. I think Lourich actually mentioned a passage there talking about Paul calling Timothy to him, but saying that everyone else had deserted, not Timothy, Mark, to him at a stage when everyone else had deserted him. So, yeah, they were both alike in continuing to support Paul there. And both he and Paul in that 2 Corinthians verse mentioned that their work was unlike others, that they, I'll read the passage that says, "For we, not like many, peddling the word of God, but we from sincerity, as from God, we speak in Christ in the sight of God." So that they didn't see themselves as people who were bartering or trading or getting their income or their way of living wasn't earned from the gospel so much, or from giving something to someone else to gain something in return in an earthly sense, but they were in all sincerity trying to speak the word of God. So in reflecting on what we know about Timothy, we can then look at some of the issues for his time, and this is mostly gained from the books to Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, written by Paul. And so we get a feel for the issues he was dealing with. Some of those are, and I'll just run through them briefly, he was dealing with doctrinal difficulties, confusing doctrines, people who were ignorant, claiming to be teachers and having knowledge of things that they didn't really understand. He's also dealing with apostasy and false teachers, people leading other people astray. He had to deal with the prevalent issue of men being more interested in themselves than God, self-seeking, which I think is a continuing theme today. He had to deal with people who didn't really want to listen to what was true, but were more interested in a good yarn and having their ears tickled. He had to deal with people who were deliberately combative to the gospel. Paul warned him about some certain people who he was challenged by and recommended he be careful of them when he come in contact with them. He had to deal with issues of administration in the new church at that stage, particularly women in the church, elders, deacons, the governance of the church at the time, how to relate to the secular authorities, and how to sort of manage some social issues like the care of widows. He dealt with times when people were more interested in money than in God, and also with the state-led persecution that was going on at the time. So, thinking about that, I thought, well, how does this compare for me at the moment? I was thinking about issues that I deal with, and this is a list of the not very exciting things that I deal with. So, things like feeling like I don't have enough time. I actually feel like a bit like that stupid monkey that you mentioned, Anita, who has their hand in the jar and has too many peanuts and can't figure out which one they need to actually hang on to. But I find I struggle to have time to do all the different things that I want to do, whether it's engaging in my different hobbies or focusing on, keeping up to speed with things at work and learning new things and doing my job better, or spending time with my family. in kids, or spending time, connecting with God, or spending time with my broader family and, making sure that we build on strengths or, navigate any issues there. I'm also focused on, how to deal with money and keeping secure, and how to act purposefully. All these kind of things absorb my time. But reflecting on that and the issues that that Timothy was dealing with, there's quite a difference there. So for all the students of the world out there, this is a phrase you will fear and tremble at. But seriously, if you consider what we know about Timothy and the things that he was dealing with, when you think about your life as individuals and our life as a group, as a church, what do you notice? Can you draw any parallels or gain any encouragement or any perhaps warnings or rebukes from what he's done? Some things that cross my mind, do you see some of the issues he dealt with in his life as an affirmation or a rebuke about how well young people are engaged in the church today, bearing in mind that Timothy was quite a young man? Is there any affirmation of how parents and grandparents deal with the kids in the church? Any rebuke about our secularised and self-preserving culture? Any caution or rebuke about our, the way we put ourselves forward with our special knowledge as a church, and the eagerness that we might do that? Or perhaps an affirmation of, how we deal with doctrinal sides of things? Are there any challenges to how we structure the church? Perhaps you see it as a provocative jab about how we deal with women in the church, or just a big question about how the church and the culture of the day mesh together or don't. When I read through there, I guess I'm affirmed a bit just about how Paul talks to Timothy, and some of the issues of the day were actually caring for one's own family members. He mentioned that when he talks about widows in the church and it being important for family to support each other. But I'm somewhat disturbed or unsettled by some of the things he mentioned, not because they're bad things, but because it sort of points me in the direction of where things need to be done more. So things like the degree to which advocating for sound doctrine was encouraged, and how Paul talks to Timothy about being ready in and out of season to talk these things through and to know what you're talking about, balanced by the rebuke to those who don't actually know what they're talking about but think they do. How do you know that you know what you know? So I find that stirs me up a bit. Also, the idea about how we deal with our money and our wealth, and being careful not to get caught in the trap of enjoying the blessings that we have at the expense of forgetting who God is, and I guess like Solomon, getting too tied up in that. I'm also disturbed by the idea of having the appearance of godliness but not the power of it. And I'm probably... The most unsettling thing is how dedicated Timothy and Paul both seem to be in their single-minded pursuit of the gospel and sharing that with others. So I wanted to bring us to the idea of who Timothy was, and his name actually means honouring God. I didn't know that before. It comes from, I don't know how to say the words, timeo and theos, I think. Timeo meaning to value, to place a value on something or to honour something. And I think that through Timothy's life we see a man who did honour God through his actions. In Isaiah 29, we're reminded, and this is, I think, something that Jesus quotes a few times in the Gospels as well, that, and this is just my little paraphrase of what it says there, but that honouring is more than providing lip service. It requires that we engage our hearts, and reverence is more than simple unthinking practice of tradition, but actually doing things intentionally and purposefully. So I guess the question to take home today that I wanted to think about myself and I'd like you to think about is, how do we live to honour God? There are a few passages that I find encouragement from in Timothy, and I've written them here. So one is to 2 Timothy 2:22, where it says, "Now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart." 1 Timothy 1:5 says, "But the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith." And 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline." So how do you live to honour God? That's something to think about.
Just quickly, just to wrap up, the thing that occurred to me sort of just when listening to everyone and what they had to say is sometimes in life we feel like we're really special, and we are in many respects. We're unique, right? We're each our own person. But then when you sort of look back in history and you think all these Bible characters, this is thousands and thousands of years ago, and you're like, well, life is so different today. And in some respects, yes, but in many respects, no. And I feel as though sort of just being reminded of some of those stories, each one of us are facing pretty much exactly the same challenges as what people were all those thousands of years ago. And you look at those people and you're like, oh, silly people, why did you do this? Why did you turn away from God? And I think exactly the same thing's applicable to us. So let's try and stay connected, particularly in the week ahead, and try and stay close to God. I'm just going to close in prayer if you want to bow your heads. Dear God, thanks so much for the freedom of being able to come here and worship you and being able to talk openly about you. Just ask that you draw close to us, help us to stay connected, help us to remember the number one thing, what's most important in life, and what's happening in our future. And just ask that you bless us and help us to be able to represent you, and be with us in the week ahead. Amen.